some chairs here. Can some of you all come here ahead? Instead of standing and crowding near the door, can you all just come ahead, some of you, please? Sit now. I'll sit around. Should I start? Um, so the rain gods have blessed us, huh? We're having this lecture in person, not just online. We were just worried whether we would be able to have this first conversations of C conversations in person in this week. Good evening. I'm Rohit Muzumdar. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2026-27 Monsoon Sea Conversation series. Um, since its inception in 2014, Sea Conversations has brought together practitioners from diverse disciplines, a wide range of disciplines, including architecture, urbanism, planning, visual studies, performing arts, literature, engineering, and the social sciences, social work and activism, in dialogue with students, faculty, and the public at large. Over here. Um, See, Conversations' aim is twofold. First, it serves as a platform for fostering a critical multidisciplinary dialogue on the relationship between space and society, engaging audiences both within the academia and beyond. Second, over here at the School of Environment and Architecture, we seek to expand the horizons of architectural thinking by encouraging exchange across disciplines and practices. Through this public engagement, See Conversations advances the Society of Environment and Architecture's mission uh, of outreach, commitment, and advocacy to contribute towards the creation of a more just world, but also what kind of intellectual, creative, imaginative resources are necessary to mobilize the creation of more just worlds. This is something that needs conversation with diverse kinds of practitioners, diverse kinds of audiences, both within the academia and beyond. So really, that's the twofold aim of C Conversations we aim to advance. Um, Just like the last several years, this year's Sea Conversations is partially supported by the Urban Center Mumbai, and its discussions are free and open to public, both in person and online. I welcome all the audiences who are online with us. Um, as a form of practice, um, Sea faculty are both curators and discussants of Sea Conversations. We curate the conversations as a series, as as larger questions that can be framed through a series of conversations, and broader dialogues that can be extended through the inquiries that different practitioners are undertaking. It's a way of extending our own practices that are operative at sea and frame a larger body of inquiry from those practices. Over the last several years, we've organized lectures around thematics like states of matter in 2022, drawing worlds and bookmakers in 2024-25, and last year architectural practice in India, a millennial archaeology um, a millennial archaeology. So let me take a few minutes to introduce this series of conversations that we will have through this year. It's titled Projections, Anticipation, and Architecture. The series dwells into the analytical and creative project of imagining futures. The majority of you over here today are architecture students, undergraduate architecture students. And at sea, in several of the studios that we are kind of engaged in, um, whether it is interrogating bodies and experience, environment and spatial form, type and behavior, ontology and institutions, mass inhabitation, um, emerging urbanism and mass inhabitation, materiality and matter or urban form and space, we are engaged in some way or the other in the project of speculating futures or imagining futures, one way or the other. Through these through the inquiries that we undertake, we not only seek to understand how the world is made, but also how it might be remade otherwise. And this is a project that is central to the discipline of architecture. For a long time, at least since the early 20th century, one of architecture's central intellectual pursuits has been to anticipate, envision, and shape possible futures. It is, so to speak, concerned with projecting new spatial possibilities and imagining the worlds that we aspire to inhabit. But anticipatory imagination is neither neutral nor objective. It is always a political practice and shapes our engagements with time, space, ecologies, and materialities, and the bodies that inhabit them. So it is an approach then to think with and think through a gathering of beings in time and space, to draw the near and far together, both in time and space, and to ask whose lives matter and are held within reach, even if contingently, in those gatherings of the futures that we imagine. During the first half of the 20th century, architects positioned themselves and their disciplinary expertise as the purveyors of the future. Over the second half of the 20th century, sustained critics challenged such perspectives, um, that that the idea of imagining futures was the preserve of architects alone, pluralizing not just the disciplines and the forms of expertise that were engaged in this intellectual project. The task of imagining futures came to be recognized as shared and negotiated beyond professional expertise. That is, also with lay knowledge is kind of being able to engage in the project of imagining futures. Yet today, across disciplines, widespread anxieties and about uncertain futures are often framed through dualistic lenses that projects either crisis, catastrophe, or apocalypse on the one hand, and technocratic utopias as on the other hand, as responses to the present, to the crisis of the present. It is in this backdrop that we ask, or this conversation series asks, what forms of spatial and design thinking and what practices of hope emerge when anticipation is understood as a widely distributed and negotiated capacity in turbulent worlds marked by deepening difference? And I mean, it's just not, it's a few months. There was a war that affected all of us in in a very in a very in a very in a very perverse way, one could say, that that didn't have to do with the majority of the world. And there is a crisis where differences across several axes of income, class, religion, caste, so on and so forth, are deepening across the world. So, when what forms of spatial and design thinking and practices of hope emerge when anticipation is understood as a widely distributed and negotiated capacity in turbulent worlds marked by deepening difference, colliding forces, uneven distributions of harm and risk, and pervasive uncertainty, just like the uncertainty that we face with the rains pouring on us over several days? And we've kind of had at least half the rain that we receive in the monsoon in this last whole week in Bombay. How do architectural practices project futures prospectively and retrospectively from the socio-spatial conditions that they engage with? So really, this series of Sea Conversations on Anticipation in Architecture, privileges both research-based as well as practice-based conversations. Our structure of the conversations is that we will alternate between a researcher engaged in thinking about questions of anticipation and futures with one practitioner who's engaged in an architectural practice. Um, so let me introduce today's frame today's conversation, and invite our speaker. So, I mean, I'm reminded in terms of introducing this conversation, there is a film that plays on HBO regularly, 2012, directed by um, Roland Emmerich. This film imagines a climate catastrophe unfolding faster than scientific predictions, prompting global leaders to activate a secret survival plan. While scientists revise their models and the G8 governments collaborate behind closed doors, 9 massive arcs are built for a privileged selection of political, scientific, cultural, and economic elites, and the resources deemed necessary to rebuild civilization. Access is purchased to these arcs, information is tightly controlled, while the vast majority of humanity is left to perish in the film. Reworking the biblical narrative, 2012 reveals the politics of anticipation, prophetic visions foresee apocalyptic futures, technocratic gatekeepers calculate inclusion, wealthy elites secure their futures, whistleblowers are silenced, and vulnerable populations face erasure. The film makes an implicit moral plea as it beckons the viewer to shape a register of inclusion on the arcs that is socially just by crafting an audiovisual imagination of apocalypse that shocks and awes its audience. Against this narrative, the first conversation that we'll have today is to think from and think with indigenous fishers of Mumbai who've been at the front lines of climate change and its responses. How do they experience climate change? How do they frame climate change? What are their conceptual imaginations of climate change? So on and so forth. Um, it's a group of 8 researchers who had met in 2024, who've been working on questions of climate change and urbanization to discuss the terms that they were finding in their own research. And the terms that they were finding in their own research did not seem to be the same as the scientific concepts that were being uh, discussed in the climate change dialogues: vulnerability, risk, resilience, so on and so forth. There were other sets of terms that were emerging in this group of people who had met together in a workshop to discuss their work. And as a part of those discussions, we realized it included Lalita Anand, Lalita Kamath, Nikhil Anand, and me, who've been collaborating on a project called Climate Action Stories together, along with 5 other researchers from other universities who've been working on similar questions. We realized that there is something over here which needs to be discussed in terms of what do these terms exactly mean, and what kind of concepts, languages, and grammars do they open out. Is there something uh, that they allow us to think about or think with that goes beyond the expert knowledges that often we hear about? So with that introduction, i'm going to introduce I'm going to invite Lalita Kamath to give her talk. Lalita Kamath is a friend with whom I've been working over the last from 2019 onwards, but she has been working on climate change research in Mumbai with fishers from 2017. It's almost a decade that she's been involved in doing this climate action research in Mumbai. So she's an urbanist working at the intersection of urban infrastructure, urban planning and governance, urban informality and the environment. She's interested in reimagining planning practice by storytelling and by drawing from fisher knowledge and the liquidities of the ocean. She teaches at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and currently is the chairperson of its Center for Urban Policy and Governance in the School of Habitat Studies. Welcome, Lalita. Uh, the discussant today with Lalita will be Prasad Khanolkar, who's also an urbanist with a background in architecture, planning, and South Asian studies. His work focuses on the incongruous and collaborative operations through which marginalized urban residents assemble lives and habitats in southern cities. He's the author of Passages of Play in Urban India, People, Media, Objects and Spaces in Mumbai's Slum Localities by Routledge, published in 2022. He teaches at the School of Environment and Architecture and is the Associate Director of the Center for Spatial Studies. So I welcome both of you. What we'll do is the format of the session is that Lalita will give her talk followed by a conversation discussion with Prasad, and then we'll open out for a discussion with the whole audience. Okay. So welcome, Lalita.
Thank you so much for that. Um, Thank you so much for that really good introduction, Rohit, and I think also making my task a lot easier by talking about the climate glossary. So I have less work to do. First of all, I want to begin by saying it's great to see so many of you here. Thank you for attending. I know this is the first of your seminar series for the year. Thank you so much. Closer. Thank you so much for the invitation to Rohit, to Rupali, Prasad, Neera, Prasad. I mean, there are so many folks at sea, several of whom I have known for some years. So wonderful to be here and to give this talk. Um, I'm going to actually quickly begin. What I can do is maybe we can hold the questions for later, as Rohit has suggested. But if there are any intervening in the middle, if there's something that you don't understand or some particular clarification, then perhaps you could ask that and I could quickly clarify before moving on. But otherwise, we can. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about this term that is one of the essays in this climate glossary. The term is Dushkal, and I'm particularly focused on Dushkal as connected to ideas of Matsya Dushkal, which is really fish drought in a very simple translation of in English. Um, I'm going to actually start by showing you a map. I know all of you are no strangers to Mumbai, but still I'll put up a map there. And I think one difference in the map and that's why I like to show this map, is that it actually showcases a number of kolivadas around the Thane Creek, which is the area that I've been working in for the last 8 or 9 years. Um, the one map marked in yellow is the Trombe Korivada. So you can see the location of this village there, where I've been particularly focusing some of my ethnographic work along with the team. I like to highlight this map also because it's very difficult. There is no real map actually that exists of Korivadas today. Many of you would have seen the old map of the different fishing villages and the different islands that then came together and made Mumbai. But in the contemporary, there's no map of the Korivadas, which I think is quite telling. And by no means is this a comprehensive map. That's the other thing I want to tell you. This was actually done through a sort of participatory exercise with a number of different fishers. And it is not comprehensive because they themselves acknowledge that they don't have a very clear idea of how many have been lost, how many still exist in different forms, maybe not active fishing, but still Koriwara. So take this as a map that we did through participatory accounts, but not a complete one. I thought I'd begin the talk by actually telling you a mystery story. And largely, this is a mystery that we encountered in the field. And I thought I'd begin it because I know this is your first talk. And hopefully, it'll make things a little bit more interesting. And you all will be convinced that you want to come back for all the rest of your seminar series. Um, so, the mystery that I want to talk about is really what I'm calling the mystery of the ice box. Okay. And that's the blue box that's showcased there. So in July of 2022, when I and my team were visiting the Koriwada of Trombe, we were particularly working in we walked into the Fishing Cooperative Society office, and we were surprised because we saw that it was bustling with fisher women. And this is something a little bit unusual because not that many fisher women are actually part of the Fishing Cooperative Society, neither are they terribly active. So this was surprising. Not just was the office buzzing, but people were talking about the news of cash transfers to bank accounts of fishers owing to cyclone compensation. And this was spreading like wildfire. So everybody was coming to the office to ask about it. And this was the first time we learned that women had ever received compensation for damages from an extreme climate event. The Maha and Kyar cyclones that happened between October and November of 2019 inflicted severe damage on the entire coast, but also on the fishing community. And cyclone aid then took the form of this cash transfer. To boat owners, they were given cash transfer, and most of the boat owners are men. And it was given for the damage to their boats. Now, interestingly, for women, or rather for fish vendors, who are almost all women, they were given conditional cash transfers to purchase 2 ice boxes worth rupees 6,000. And they had to, in fact, provide receipts for this. So this is when we became stuck on the mystery of why ice boxes for women. Do ice boxes, in fact, provide adequate relief for the losses suffered due to cyclones? And that's something that really, we struggled with this for several months. So some of the questions that were being asked. So what bill do you need now? Oh God, do you need a Xerox copy too? I have to go cook dinner. So there were all these questions. And what we realized is that faced with uncertainty about where to seek help, whom to approach, women accepted largely whatever was handed to them, but there were unknown numbers of them who didn't receive anything at all. And so conversations with fisher leaders and a very close scrutiny of the administrative instrument of the government regulation, or the GR, that was issued in 2020, revealed that a government aid package was issued to fishers, but only when they demanded the declaration of Matsya Dushkal, or fish drought. And so really then, the initial mystery of this ice box led us then to this second mystery of what is Matsya Dushkal. So first we began with a English translation. We said, okay, fish drought. And the notion of drought was a very common one, very well known, and had circulated a lot. So we said, okay, fish drought. But we soon realized that in fact it was a highly reductive translation. In fact, there was a lot that was lost in the translation, and it had a very different power in Marathi. And so refocusing on Dushkal, I want to start with this, is really then one that requires attention to time, the length of time, and the uncertainty of its duration. So unlike a single spectacular disaster, what this points to, the term, if you break the word up, the portion kal refers to a measure of time that is a much longer period, something like an era, but it's a period also that's without a clear beginning or an end. Now, if you look at the first part of Dushkal, Dush signifies bad times, a culturally rooted concept from the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. And so while we began, in fact, as I said, with the mystery of the ice box, we realized to answer that, we needed to really think about what actually was fish drought and what is its connection to cyclone relief. So we spent some time thinking about asking people, what is Matsya Dushkal? And it was hard, in fact, to locate the exact provenance, the beginnings of this term. But it is a very commonly word known and used across many communities and across many landscapes, not just coastal landscapes, but also agricultural landscapes. Increasingly, it's being used in the Himalayas for snow landscapes, etc. And so this was some of the responses that a group of Kori women actually gave us. And as you can see, the responses were quite varied. And what we then, it took us some time to do this, but what we figured is that each woman's voice then contributes a piece in this larger puzzle that we then assemble to form a composite picture of how fishers are differently affected in what we termed as the time of Dushkal. Now, globally, there's increasing recognition that the climate crisis has already changed and is still changing urban climates. There's also a lot of discussion on how this needs to be alleviated. And in fact, there's been so many discussions on notions of loss and damage. And this is particularly important in discussing climate justice today. But really, I think the big issue has been, how do you define, for example, disaster? What constitutes disaster? What constitutes loss and harm? And there's very little clarity on actually how to develop policies to address this. So in the talk, what I do is two things. First, I examine how government responds to crisis. And in this talk, crisis here is extreme weather event of cyclone. And how they respond is by enacting a very particular type of compensation regime. And here, to unpack this, I focus on very much on practices, particularly bureaucratic and administrative practices, by looking at this instrument that I've defined earlier of the GR, or the government resolution. And one reason I do this is because there's been actually a lot of people write about the climate crisis and its impact, looking at what's written on paper. So if you look at plans or vision statements or even policy documents, but there's a huge amount that in fact then changes when you actually translate this in administrative language of practice. And so really then I focus in this talk on the opaque world of the GRs as a way to understand this compensation regime. The second thing that I do in the talk is I map the contours of what crisis and the idea of loss and damage means to fishers locally, and how they both accept it, but they also stretch it and subvert it in different ways. And they do this by deploying this term, Dushkal. Now, as a small sort of addition here, I just want to add, there's been some amount of work on, especially from critical urbanists, who've talked about compensation, so especially monetary compensation, as a very problematic thing, because what it does is it seeks to commodify or to translate simply in monetary terms damages that have been experienced as a result of a certain kind of crisis or disaster. And one of the main arguments they make against this is saying that it depoliticizes, in fact, communities and governance in general. So I want to just say here that some of this work and what I'm still sort of working on as I go forward is really, in fact, how do I nuance this story? Because in some ways, what I'm finding is that far from depoliticization, I'm actually seeing all kinds of new forms of politicization that are occurring through this compensation regime. So I'll share one or two here, and then maybe we can also have further discussion. So the year 2019-20 was a particularly difficult year for fishers, for sure. 5 major cyclones hit the west coast of Mumbai, and this is very unusual and perhaps illustrating already the crisis we are facing. Not only that, both the Maha and Kyar cyclones were extremely severe. They came right one after the other, and the cascading effects of all these cyclones were followed by the COVID pandemic and the lockdown. And so there was devastation in the fishing communities. And so what they did, in fact, there was huge pressure from them. And under this pressure, in fact, what we see then is that government then proffers some kind of very limited support. And this limited support was a very reductive, gendered strategy that fishers, especially women, found highly inadequate. As I mentioned, limited boat compensation for damage to boats and limited an ice box for women. So on the face of it, this tussle around cyclone relief, it reveals in fact real problems of governance and two very different, very oppositional ways of framing crisis. One is how government frames climate disasters, which is a very narrow, reductive one, and also the limits of this kind of crisis thinking. And the second is really then a much more expansive framing of fishers, which is articulated by their expression of the term Matsya Dushkal. But I also argue that at the heart of this contestation between fishers and government is also a notion of time and futurity that are conjured up by Dushkal. And what this does is, in fact, blurs the difference, the line between the everyday and the eventful disaster. And it also foregrounds multiple kinds of temporalities and spaces in which these temporalities play out that are integral to fisher life and fisher future making. The term Matsya Dushkal is not a new one. It constitutes proof of a tug of war that's been going on, in fact, since at least the 1960s. So our search of government resolutions, in fact, identified that we could identify the earliest discussion from 1960s. And what we learned by looking at these GRs over time is that there is a pattern that emerges each time in how government responds and frames disaster. There are two ways in which it responds. The first is it announces a package of very limited aid. Okay. The second is it appoints, and this is, I think, something that we are very accustomed to in institutions. It appoints a committee to decide whether there is indeed a Matsya Dushkal or not. Okay. So if I unpack each of these a little bit, in the first case, this package of limited aid, if you look, we looked at several different policy documents on disaster and disaster recovery. And many of them actually quite broad in the way they describe it. So, for example, they talk about socio-natural events that cause disruption for which government provides temporary aid or relief. Okay. But in the language of bureaucratic practice, when we look at the government, the GRs, we actually see a different term being used, one which is Naisargik Apatti, which is natural disaster. This term is used. The other term that's very interesting to note is the term compensation or bharpai, which is in fact the term that fishers use all the time. In fact, they only used this term. So I was surprised initially because the GR didn't include this word at all. So it doesn't include this word, the GR. In fact, what the GR includes is the term Sanugraha Anudan. So often the money that's given is termed what is termed ex gratia aid. I don't know, many of you might be familiar or maybe not so familiar with this term. But what ex gratia aid means is really it connotes a sense of moral obligation, but not legal requirement. And an interview with a government, with an official from the disaster management department actually revealed this very clearly, because we were saying, how come, why, we were looking for compensation. How do you think about compensation? And he replied saying, losses coverage is not the aim. Always remember this. It is not financially possible for government to cover losses fully. If I look at the second aspect in which the way government frames and responds to crisis, the appointment of a committee. In all cases, the committee later declares that the phenomenon of Matsya Dushkal doesn't exist. Okay? Except for once in 1979, there was some partial acknowledgement. So if we look at then what are the procedures for declaring Matsya Dushkal, the government's formula for determining whether to declare Dushkal is based on whether the fish production in a particular year falls below 50% of the average fish production of the last 3 years. And this criterion has never been fulfilled according to the fisheries department in the state. And so therefore, Dushkal has not been declared. But fishers have challenged this very strongly by talking about, in fact, how to think about Dushkal and the temporalities of Dushkal. They argue, for example, that Dushkal is a dynamic and slow onset event. It is caused by multiple factors, and they, in fact, enunciate what these factors are. They talk about pollution, they talk about infrastructure projects, they talk about overfishing and technology, which is given to improve and use high technology extractive mechanisms for fishing. And all of this is underwritten by the state. And more recently, cyclones are also added to the list of those factors that, in fact, lead to Dushkal. They also talk about how Dushkal affects different communities within fishing in very different ways. And so they say that you cannot measure it solely on the metric of production. In fact, it requires other ways of knowing and measuring value. And in conversations, in bits and pieces with them over the years, they have advanced three major arguments contesting this notion. And I'm going to just quickly go through each of these. First, they challenge the government's production numbers, saying that they are very far from the on-ground experience of small-scale fishers. And so this is very much a class-related exclusion that they are talking about, and that they're talking that this compensation regime does not account for. Small-scale fishers, in fact, comprise the bulk of the state's fishers. They often come back from the sea with very poor catches, while larger mechanized boats using very extractive techniques of fishing can still get good catches. And so overall, the statistics of fish production doesn't reveal a significant shortfall. So what they say is that the government's overwhelming focus on production numbers doesn't reflect, in fact, the labor and of the bulk of the small scale fishers. It also doesn't measure two other kinds of value: ecological value and social value of fairness. So fishers basically are arguing that ecological value, in fact, which the state should measure, is really about measuring the health of the ocean and the seas and it as a habitat. And the second is really one of the social value of fairness, where they talk about how there should be some balance within the fishing communities. And one fishing community should not benefit exclusively over others, at the expense of others, basically. And so really, they call for then thinking about these other ways of valuing, which the sole measure of production does not do. This focus on class contestations is also interesting because it reveals the huge divisions and fragmentations within the fishing communities, both within Koris as well as between Koris and what are seen as non-Koris, often termed as migrants. And there are many so these are very complicated and very fractured communities we are talking about. A second way in which Dushkal offers the opportunity for fishers to contest the way in which government defines crisis is it offers the opportunity to acknowledge what I call uncanny hyperlocal changes that cause ongoing suffering but are pretty invisible in formal maps and plans. And I'm going to give you a small story here about a set of fish dryers of Zaula. And in October to May of 2022, these fisher women suffered major losses because their Zaula started blackening. And if you look at the photograph on the right here, you'll see the one below is really the blackened one, and the one on top is how it normally looks. And women were convinced that this was caused by a set of different reasons. The two major ones they talked about were, one is cyclonic disturbances in the Bay of Bengal, and also bridge construction in the in the Thane Creek. And this was really the Thane Creek Bridge 3 that they were talking about. Now, while the exact reasons for the blackening were never traced, and they all lost a lot of money per fisherwoman, these were not accounted for, But the production of Zawla was not affected. Only its quality was affected because it became unsellable. And so they argued that this shows how certain fishers in a particular locality can be deeply affected by uncanny, unpredictable, hyper-local phenomena without disturbing the overall production figures. They also talk about the increased incidence of these uncanny events. And if you look on the left side, I'm showing you something that they have no name for, but they have multiple times talked about its incidence. They locally call it Mali, but it's not that's their word for it. I don't know how else to call it. um, the third way that they contest um, government notions of crisis is what they do through their use of dushkal is by challenging the gaps in scientific methodology for fish data collection by institutions that collect it. And so what they do is they observe that the fisheries department is understaffed. It is both unable and unwilling to check illegal fishing practices, especially of larger boats and boat owners. There's a lot of uh, allegations that they make about collusion of different sorts. And so state departments, fisheries departments are under a lot of pressure from their state government to declare erroneously high fish production numbers, say fishers. Now, this is, and let me go back to the earlier slide. This is unlike the Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, which is a public institution, but it's a central government institution. And so if you look at the actual difference in numbers, it's actually quite significant. And fishers, in fact, have argued that the reason for this is because CMFRI figures are more accurate. They're not under pressure to inflate their numbers. And based on Fisher's evidence, in fact, a Marathi newspaper, the Tarun Bharat, published an article showing this divergence. It caused a lot of, as you can imagine, conflict and discussion. And subsequently, there have been some interesting happenings on that front, which I can talk about if anyone's interested later. The last way in which we see, in fact, some very interesting exclusions in compensation regime is really looking at gender. And I'm giving you two quotes here, one from the Fishing Cooperative Society, and the second one is from a mid-level fisheries department official. And I think the quotes are pretty self-explanatory to highlight really the way in which what kinds of exclusions women face from both these levels. Now, the Fishing Cooperative Society is the society which is formed within each Kolivada, and it was in fact formed at the behest of the state government, and it was seen as a bridge between fishing communities and the state government. But these communities also work in interesting ways, both collaboration but also confrontation. So this, which is the lowest level of governance of fishing sector in the state, an office bearer said, women didn't really face any loss. They are given ice boxes just for the sake of giving something. And maybe because nobody knows whether these women are actually selling fish, ice boxes were prescribed. And they were made to give receipts to double check that they're using it for the right purpose. The fisheries department official, on the other hand, talked about how boat owners, who are typically male, are registered with them. And so therefore he sees them as constituents of the department, but they don't have a record of fisher women. They are registered with the BMC as market vendors or street vendors, but even there they don't have a license. And even if they produce a vending license, how do we know if if the women will use the money given as cyclone aid for their business only? So the picture so far reveals that official knowledge is focused on quantitative, economic, and engineering measures. It ignores how ongoing climate crises are often experienced in terms of all kinds of losses, which are quite often very intangible and difficult to quantify, losses of livelihood, of land, sea, of identity. And in a special issue on disaster justice in Asia, Douglas and Miller, in fact, argue that this dictates very narrow notions of compensation, which, in fact, are devoid of justice altogether. And so they don't actually focus then on broader historical understandings of social vulnerability and the social spatial production of risk. So overall, my argument is that in asserting the arrival of Dushkal, Fishers articulate then a blurring of the line between the everyday and the eventful disaster. And this everydayness of disaster, I often describe it as the long dyings that they live both in and with. And these are long dyings of different sorts, of certain fish species, of the coast that they used to know, of particular islands that they used to fish in that they're no longer allowed access to, of a mode of inhabitation that they used to have but is becoming increasingly difficult. So these long dyings that they live in and with, and this everydayness of them, remind us that these have long histories, and also remind us of the complex ways in which the past is folded into the present and the future. And so, really, the stories that then I tell, a lot of this work focuses on these stories and then really the stuff of long dyings. They are constituted by then connecting older historical legacies of coastal development with ongoing living in and also ongoing struggles for environmental justice in Mumbai's coasts and seas. So, in fact, here I follow scholars who do this work of studying how the past still endures in the present. So, for example, scholars like Christina Sharp, who has talked about the history and the presence of slavery through her notion of wake work. Or I've looked at Sharad Chari, who has connected the legacies of apartheid in South Africa with ongoing struggles for environmental justice in South Durban through the idea of what he calls a racial palimpsest that captures both how past injustices happen, but also how they influence the present. And so I see the struggle then between Fishers and the government over acknowledging Dushkal as a much older struggle that highlights these very violent and extractive capitalist histories of waste making and property making that are still ongoing. I'll spend the next few minutes, in fact, talking about 3 phases of this ongoing history of long dying at a more sort of macro scale that I want to talk about. I'll sort of merge them all quite quickly due to lack of time. But if you look at, so the 3 phases, the first phase is really one of British imperial design. So this is the time of the colonial state and the making of the creek as an industrialized, polluted waterway. The second major phase is one of nationalist imaginaries. And these, in fact, have continued to produce the coast as an industrialized and polluted waterway, where both dumping happens and property making happens. And so these 2 maps that I want to show you, if you look at the one on the right-hand side, that's a close-in. It's a 1930s BPT, Bombay Port Trust map, showing you a zoom in of some of the land, one huge land reclamation that was done to build the colonial Bombay port. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you a map that was done again with a team, and this is by no means a full map, but it's a map showing sewage treatment plants in the entire MMR. Now, please note, these are only formal locations. There are huge numbers of informal dump sites, which I've not included. We have also a similar map done for dump sites, garbage dump sites, which I won't show. But what you will notice, which is not a surprise to any of us, is really that all of them are in the creeks and in the wetlands, basically. And also noteworthy is that both right from the first mention that was found in the archives of the Thane Creek was actually by Bombay sanitary engineers talking about the potential of the creek as a sanitary dump site. And so from then on to right today, even when the local governments are thinking about new and scientifically designed sewage treatment plants, they are all being located in the wetlands. So the third phase that, in fact, I want to talk about really is one of neoliberal interventions. This is a much more recent one, starting really in the 90s and picking up speed. These are neoliberal interventions for remaking the coast as the new resource frontier through both intensified industrialization, but also through planned deindustrialization. So I want you to look For example, take a look at the map on the left-hand side, this one, which is in fact a screen grab from a tweet that was done some years ago, showing the Eastern Waterfront Development Project. And this is really a big chunk of the port lands, the Bombay port lands are being redeveloped through planned deindustrialization. And so all these now lands are available to be redeveloped for new green purposes. What are these greening projects? Things like ecotourism, real estate development. There's a number of them. And what is happening, the second part of this is if you have planned deindustrialization, you also have intensified industrialization. And so if you look at the right-hand map, what I really argue is that industrialization is being pushed out regionally to the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, which is located on the other side of the creek in Navi Mumbai. So huge industrial activities ongoing there. And on this side, you have repurposing for green projects and plans. And so Fishers, in fact, have been among the most vociferous critics of this remaking of coastal worlds through infrastructure. And they've advanced not just protests, but also litigation. And a lot of this work, in fact, and the arguments they make, in fact, echoes scholarship by social scientists who argue that city bureaucrats' prime objective is to build infrastructure, and climate planning is often only a secondary objective. It's one objective, but often a secondary one. And this infrastructural imaginary, in fact, is a multi-scalar imaginary, because if you look at Sagarmala on the right-hand side, you'll see that this is a national project powered by the Ministry of Shipping, and it's an enormous project planning on connecting ports across the country and also connecting them to their hinterland and to inland waterways as well. So these embody not just nationalist, but global visions of a new India in the world. Each of the factors, therefore, that Fishers name, in fact, spans these overlapping timescales, causing them significant harms. And over time, what I argue is that they accrete to become Dushkal, or the long disaster. And the slowness of this temporality is treacherous precisely because it is very difficult to see at a particular moment in time that it is happening. It's also difficult to connect what seems to be very different, disparate issues across long time periods. So the manner then in which Dushkal reframes crisis recalls Povinelli's very powerful argument for considering the Anthropocene and the related concept of climate change as not simply a meteorological and geological event, but also to think of it as a set of political and conceptual disturbances that are already changing the way we think and the way that we do politics. And here I argue, in fact, that we can see this in the case of creek fishers in Mumbai. On the one hand, I argue this impels fishers to struggle to stretch the state's compensation regime to better fit their ability to live with water, to continue to practice fishing as a livelihood, and to continue with older modes of inhabitation. But on the other, they continue to anticipate other future times and undertake practices that are oriented to temporal scales of land, not water, those that are rooted in colonialism, bureaucratic governance, and the making of property. And so here, practices of futurity, I'm calling, as I term them here, and as we term them in our glossary as a whole, they represent actions to rehabit or to inhabit differently in and after crisis. And I'm going to end, really, this is the last part of the talk, but really to look at 3 short, small vignettes that illustrate then such practices of futurity where fishers seek to rehabit or inhabit differently in a time of crisis. And these are vignettes from a much more intimate vantage point, very different from the sort of macro scale ones I gave you earlier. So the first one, if I talk about the anticipating future times, if you look at the slide, I look at the first moment of anticipating future times that I want to talk about is how, due to pollution, this creek is growing increasingly muddy through slow accretions. And these are processes of siltation. as scientists call them. And in fact, media also has talked about them as siltation, and we study siltation in school. And it's a productive force of nature. Here, silt is in fact particles of garbage and sewage. Um, and so, really thinking then about what this materiality of sewage or pollution in the chikkar, in the marsh that fishers wade through, what does it actually connote? What can it be a diagnostic of? And with this contamination, the textures of the marsh are changing. Many types of fish and clams and mudskippers can no longer survive, and fishers' futures are also tied to these fish futures. And so, increasingly, what we see then is male fishers are exiting fishing. Okay, so one way of rehabiting. A second vignette that I want to talk about is really then looking at women fishers. One of the discussions that happen time and again is really talk of time and the tedium involved, the labor involved in cleaning plastic from fish. And there's a lot of discussion about what kind of plastic we actually went through and sorted out. And it's the kind of plastic, which fish can deal better with plastic, which fish perish immediately. So there's all these new knowledge that women are gaining as a result of this labor. And this is tied, in fact, also to women's lesser ability to exit. And so this is also something that we see as in some sense, a condition of stuckness, because they have less education, they have less ability to leave the Korivada. There are cultural norms associated with what they can do in the future. And so this means then that they, in some ways, practice a form of waiting. Many of them talk about waiting for the next generation to be able to take up jobs and then release them from this work. And the third vignette that I wanted to highlight is really one of the wetlands around the Korivada. And some years ago, in a very powerful statement, I think a activist called Dhrubajyoti Ghosh from Kolkata, talking about the East Kolkata wetlands, talked about wetlands as, quote unquote, real estate in waiting. And so this is really very much a third vignette that I want to just highlight and leave here to think of then how do we then think of wetlands, or what are new ways of rehabiting. These are not new ways, but let's say these are ways of rehabiting or inhabiting in and amidst crisis. So to conclude, Fisher's activation then of a narrative of Dushkal calls forth counter timelines and counter narratives. It disrupts then the singular event-based notion of disaster, and also the very limited relief provided by the state. And then Dushkal seeks to reframe crisis planning and also crisis governance through a culturally embedded politics and practice. And in fact, I did talk very much about this, but really there's a lot that when we can discuss this later about also the Ramayana and this idea of then, in some sense, an appropriation of the story of Ram. And what this means then, what is this time of Dushkal, a time of all destruction. But it's also a time then for making change or making more moral decisions. So this culturally embedded politics and practice, interestingly, rather than working within the domains of formal city planning, city level climate plans, or department centered disaster planning. So this is interesting because, from my own work of doing, studying planning and climate plans, and also looking at disaster management plans, fishers, in fact, evade these. And their practices, in fact, show that their viability and inhabitation then of these creek worlds that are increasingly amphibious. They are muddy, they are both land and water. And so their, in fact, viability and inhabitation then is dependent on how they simultaneously navigate these different temporal scales and future making projects, both sea and land. So that's the end of the talk. As a postscript, I want to just end with where I began. And I don't know if any of you were curious about the mystery of the icebox. But it was finally cleared up for us when after several months of asking people, a disaster management expert, when he was looking at the GR, he noticed the budget code. Okay, it's a 4-digit code in the GR. And the code tells you where the budget, which department and broadly centered the money is from. And so he suddenly said, oh, 2405. Yes, that's the disaster management department. And so likely iceboxes were listed as a program by the fisheries department in their department disaster management plan. And therefore, officials found it easy to execute once the cyclone hit, since a budget line already existed. And so I think for me, this was really something, and I want to end here really. This starkly illustrates that disaster planning then is currently done institutionally at the level of departments without much understanding for how disasters like cyclones land in the coast or in the lives of residents. So I'm going to end here. And I haven't talked about the glossary. Rohit gave you an introduction to it, but also happy to take it in Q&A. Shall I? Sure.
Um, Thanks, Lalita, for that wonderful conversation. I'm going to invite Prasad to be in conversation with Lalita. Yeah, please join us here. I mean, we just to make one point as a larger point, that indigeneity changes the way in which narratives of climate change are kind of framed. In my own work that I've been engaged in with it in the same as a part of the same project, Adivasis, Adivasi residents in the national park of Mumbai say the climate of their inhabitation changed when the British started planting new trees. So the change, the timeline of the climate crisis, it's not in the near future or the far future or in the present. It was something that happened way back in the 19th century. So I'll stop there. I'll invite Prasad to be in conversation with Lalita.
Thanks, Rohit. Firstly, thanks, Lalita, for the talk. Uh, I did it. It uh, one of the things, although it is framed as a question of time, right? But it is in many ways a way, just the photographs, but also the maps and the way in which there's a sense of hyper localization of this global event that we term climate change, right? So it has, in some sense, these multiple ripples that it's causing in different parts of even just Bombay. I mean, the way in which you sort of, right? And before I get to that, I wanted to sort of start with a term that, uh, in some sense, I was wondering why it uh, becomes a part of the work as well as the way in which it is framed, which is this idea of crisis, right? And there's this book by Janet Reutemann called, Anti-Crisis, which says that, the moment you sort of introduce the term crisis, which is the financial crisis, health crisis, any kind of crisis, there's almost an auto response to it. And that the auto response is always that this is the only way something can happen, right? Which is you either bail out or there's, compensation or so I was wondering why the crisis, because if it's a question of a long, slow, right, dying, which the time is not something that we know when it's starting, when it's going to end. In that sense, the crisis still has an eventful urgency that it brings into that moment, right? So I was wondering, if you can, like why crisis becomes important term to even speak about the climate in that sense, right? Like, why is crisis such a like we don't describe sort of the ice age as a crisis in that sense, right? But there's something about the way in which we've thought today that we termed crisis. So I was wondering why crisis becomes such an important term to frame both time, but also the process that is going on, what is going on in terms of the life in the sea and amongst the fisher. Like why it becomes an important term in that sense.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, in fact, a lot of the way in which I think about or talk about crisis is really about then distinguishing between the way in which official notions of what this is seen as and how to respond to it. So, the official notion is very much one centered on the eventful crisis based kind of approach. And in the glossary, I a little bit developed some of the notions of that, and in other work, I mean, I didn't focus it on it so much today, but I do talk a lot about, I draw from Janet Reutemann, but I think I develop more Masco's work on crisis, where he talks about crisis as, in fact, a very convenient way to sort of continue with the status quo. And the way in which crisis is, of course, framed is very ideological. And so clearly you have to think about particular interests that are served by framing it in a particular way. And so to sort of disentangle that notion of crisis, I think is really critical. So that I would totally agree with. I think what I see from Fisher's also very interestingly is that they respond to terms. First of all, they don't use the term crisis. So this was in some ways, in my abstract, I use it thinking about, but they use it to talk about, to highlight something urgent that calls for action. So in that sense, they are very much calling for action. Though, and this is in some ways the challenge then of having a slow disaster, because at which point or how do you then think about response? And this, I think, is really then really the big question that I'm grappling with, because I've been following also multiple cases of compensations, and what it ends up being is really very individualized and based on one-time monetary compensation. And so there is huge debate, and there's also huge conflict among the fishing community about this. And in some ways, there's no consensus on what it should be or what it should represent. But rather, it's then about all they will say is that this is not the way. And different, so I have different sort of responses. Two particular ideas here. One is community centered, some kind of response that should focus on communities and community spaces, community projects. And the other is ecology, which is completely neglected in all of this. So I think these are in terms of just responses from fishing communities. And I think it's, but they also use terms like, I think that notion of response is very then in some ways important to focus on rather than crisis per se, but crisis often triggers a response. One thinks or one sees it as such, but in fact, Masco argues, and I would agree with him in this case, that in fact, it doesn't trigger a reparative response, but in fact, more of the same.
Right.
So that's also maybe a point that
I also wanted to sort of think, about like if you can expand a bit more on this idea of, what you call the multiplicity of time, right? In the sense of, and this is something that, we do this study every year, which has a similar question, which is what is happening in coastal areas of India, right? So the students have been traveling to, say, Odisha or different parts. Some of them are here, right, to understand really what is going on in terms of the shifts that are going on as a result of the climate change in these small towns, right? And one of the things that does uh, sort of always play into the work, right, is this sense of uh, uh, ecological relationships, right? Which is that, either it's the tide, or is it, it's the sort of seasons, it's the lunar cycles. There's that sense of, there's that temporality of the environment that is always tied into the life in some sense, right? And it has a certain, you know, uh, in that sense, what it like not cyclicality to it, but sort of a movement to it that always comes and goes in that sense. Uh, so which has started changing in many ways, right? And so I was wondering, what is the like the history that they've been framing, right? Which in that sense doesn't have a beginning or an end, but it's something that has been going on for a while, right? And it's sort of read in a way of what you're calling slow dying, that the species, islands, life that seems to be going away, right? But is there something that uh, in that sense, like it still has the thing of, it has all is it a question of speed, right? Like when you term it as a slow thing, right? Like a slow one, is it a question of speed, or is it a question of a different movement of time, which is tied into the ecology of which they're a part, right? And in that sense, then what I would ask is, like, what is this, what is the sense of time that one can open up, right, for us to start looking at these relationships differently, like, which is part of, if one is to think about climate action plans, about different uh rationality of just time, of what compensation means, right? So if you could tell us a bit more about, like, what is this sense of ecology within which operates, and how does that tie into this idea of what you're calling slowness? Is it just the question of slowly what this idea of slow violence, that where lives are abandoned and sort of, but is there something that is different that one needs to pay attention to, right?
Question, and I'll see if I can do it justice. So I think, in fact, I started with looking. So there's, in some senses, one would think of broadly two kinds of multiple, I think, um, time scales and time spaces that we're looking at, which are really sort of at a macro level, if you're looking at those relating to living with sea. So, for example, fishing as a livelihood and as a mode of inhabitation has, for a very long time, meant that fishers have collaborated with their environment and their particular ecology and its rhythms to understand a particular version of time. Okay, and this is very much based on ecological rhythms. So, for example, they'll still talk about, like, if I always remember the story that when we were making this film on them a few years ago, we would ask, the filmmaker was asking, how long does it take to go from here to there? And he was like, no, we can go tomorrow, we can go at this time, and then we'll go, and then it'll turn and come back. And then she was like, no, like, but how long does it take? Does it take 30 minutes? Does it take 40 minutes? And so this conversation of back and forth where she kept asking about time in terms of standardized minutes, and he kept responding. And then he couldn't answer what. And then it's only later that really I realized that these were completely two different paradigms that were actually, that's why they were stuck, really. Because what he was referring to, this is a tidal creek. So you go up to a certain point and you wait and you put your net in, and then when the tide turns, the boat turns and you come, that's how you come back. And so there's no question of time in terms of standardized minutes, right? I mean, so this is how, in fact, they have lived for a very long time. And in fact, this is how they've used space. So a lot of my, in fact, earlier work focused on really this, to look at what I call fishing time, and really how it conditions then the use of space. Okay. But what you also have to factor in is, and I think this is an issue also with thinking about an indigenous fishing community, there tends to be a lot of essentializing and romanticizing indigenous people's relation to nature. And so I think, particularly when you're looking at them in the heart of a big city, fishers, in fact, I would say, have always navigated, in fact, between, you know, very simplistically, I'm calling the city of the sea and the city of property. So I think these different, so again, if you're thinking of then these longer sort of temporal scales, one is really the rhythms of the sea and water, but the other is one very much of land, rooted in land, and a certain set of ideas around colonial planning, cartography, and the whole idea of making property, which is seen as far more valuable. And for that, you need to define clean edges, clear lines, and water doesn't do it. So in which case, then you have to reclaim land from. So I think it's these two at a broad level, but I think the vignettes are ended with, in fact, hint at some of these. I don't always talk about them explicitly. Also because, so one of the things, in fact, I'm looking at is that the fact of inhabiting both at the same time and simultaneously navigating and inhabiting both is really the big, it's both a challenge, but it's also in some ways something that we can learn from, I think. But this space, this kind of space of muddiness is, I think, very important and critical. It's a space of very much of contradiction embodied in it, and how they navigate it. Again, it's a very differentiated story. It's not a single story. So,
I mean, I also asked this because, uh, I mean, tides have a certain power to sort of, erode and bring back life, right? And if I was to look at the history of what you've shown, which is that, the fishing villages have always been at the foreground of a number of these large infrastructure projects, right? Starting from the eastern waterfront to the port to, say, all the sanitation, sewage treatment plants and the dumping yards and all of those things, right? And in that sense, if it's something that they've I mean, not just them, but also the whole ecology has lived through all of that, and has, in some sense. So I don't know necessarily numbers, but I was thinking that is there something about the ecology in that sense that has, like, in the sense of, am I reading the history as a history of Dushkar that has been going on for this long time since the colonial time, right? Or can I also read it as a history of in a set of relationships that have endured and have managed to either, work themselves, or is there a sense of a reparative nature built into it that has endured through these large projects, right? So, and if that is the case, right, and which is also why I'm asking about it, in a sense of thinking about it, ecologically, and in tides, in the sense of, is there something that comes back and changes and goes away and comes back and changes, right? Is there something that, in that sense, it's not the slow thing that is sort of dying, but is there something about it that is constantly enduring and shifting and enduring, shifting? Because if it's lived through all of that, right? So then there's a different sense of time that seems to be, to me, to be operating, right? And so I was, which is also why I was asking if it has, like, how would you see it differently?
again, Prasad, a really interesting question. And I would say that there are really multiple, then at one point I was even calling it heterotemporalities, but I'm not sure that I still want to stick with that term. But let's say multiple temporalities within which they operate, and temporality is connected very closely to space. So time and space. So it's, and maybe a preferable word is spatiotemporality. I don't know. But absolutely, I think that is, so there are nested versions, I would argue. And so you have these longer temporal scales you're looking at of, say, colonial planning and land-based planning, and then on the other hand working with the sea. But and then there are, and these vary for different communities. So for example, those who do khajani, the like picking of crabs in the intertidal zone at in the marsh of the intertidal zone, they have a particular rhythm which is different from those who are fishing in the sea, which is different from those who are picking oysters on the rocky beach of Worli. So, like, I mean, I think there's huge variability, which is, and very much there is enduring of some of these relationships. In fact, I think the nature of these tenurial relations is very important. And in fact, I think Rohit and I are working on a piece really to make this very argument that these in some ways are can be seen as spaces where which are being reimagined and reinvented, but also erased and let go also. I mean, I think in some sense there's both a conceding but also a reclaiming, or there's an estrangement and a reclaiming, and both things are happening, and based on, I think, again, different subject positions that are being taken by different fishers. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm conscious of not speaking
Right.
for too long, so I'm going to stop here. But
I was also thinking that, again, this is something sort of connected to it, is that, I mean, because we're all architects and we sort of tend to work with, the plans and maps, right? That's something that we were familiar with, right? And time tends to, like in your narrative, right, there is a sense of this extended time which doesn't have an origin, doesn't have an end in that sense, right? And I was wondering if one is to also think about space in that sense, right? In the sense of that, although this large event of global climate change, that it's always framed in, and then you have measures of how much temperature, how much sea warming, how much there are always these measures that are given as if it's something that is a global event, right? But it's highly, like you're saying, hyper localized, right? But I was also wondering that it is in that sense a global, like if I was to extend the map of Bombay, right, from the Koliwaras all the way south and towards the west. And I'm thinking about the sea, right, not also in its longer sense, right? So it's not a thing of romanticizing, this relationship with nature, but that ecological relationship also have an extended sense like time does, right? So space is also in that sense an extended version of, like, the fish have an extended life, like, right? So does that, again, that extended sense of space of, right, does that then also change how one sees, and which is again this idea of, there's a work that I keep referring to. It's called, it's by this Caribbean poet called Kamo Brathwaite, who talks about this notion of tidialectics, right? Which is that something comes and something shifts, but it keeps coming. Right? And it comes from this history of the African slavery, which is sort of extended, right? Uh, and so for them, the sea has that extended life, that, right, that they've sort of traveled to arrive, right? And it has that ripple effects, right? Although it has this ripple effects, it keeps coming back to it, right? And so I was wondering that sense of, which is why I also said, like, if one extends that space beyond the boundaries of, like, if I see an environment in a larger sense, does that then also reframe the term dushkar, right? I don't mean that in the sense of critiquing the usage of it, is if it's if it allows you to look at it in a way different sort of.
Really nice question. Um, and here I would just briefly refer to also some of the climate glossary and the way we are thinking about framing that as well, to respond to the last part, I think, of your um, question. Ooh, I had my thought all clearly outlined and now it's suddenly vanished. Um, but okay, so I'll come back to that when it comes back to me. But let me just actually start with this notion of extended space. And so I think what I realized quite soon on was really that for Fisher's, time was really very important and in some senses led the space part. So Fisher time, in fact, dictated how space was used and how space also expanded or retreated based on the tide, based on full moon, based on because that dictated how much fish catch would come in and how much of the ground would be used for different fishing related purposes and how much was left available for other things. Okay. But what we're increasingly seeing is that inversion now, where in fact space and land is becoming now more and more. So that's, I think, one very clear, and you can see that clearly generationally. So, for example, younger people, and this is not just fishing communities, but in general, I would say I've read indigenous works of works on indigenous communities in multiple parts. And there's a sense from young youth who say, oh, our elders never understood the importance of property and of individual titles and having the clear title, and they were happy with things like commons and this idea of extended notion, and see the problem we are in today. And so in fact there's a much greater demand in fact for individual titles from the next generation. And again, this is not universal, but I'm saying in many communities, including, for example, in Mizoram, which is another place that I work in with indigenous communities. So, and but at the same time you have very much these older ideas also very much prevail and shape newer practices. And so, in fact, I'm a little bit working on detailing some of this. To give you just a very quick example, we would ask, when we were asking things like questions of, we would ask, we noticed that when we are asking things like just having conversations, there would be a very fluid way in which home was used, which was almost collapsed with village. And when we explored that a little further, we realized that what they did through it was just a very expanded sense of home, which was not just the residential space in which they lived. So it was not just the house, but it was very much then not just the space outside the house. It was the intertidal zone, the marsh. It was the coastal seas in which they used, and so it was a very open sense in which they saw space. And they talked about their home and their village. Again, they would use different words. Sometimes they would use vada, and so the vada was like almost that extra space that they saw as theirs. And so today there are a lot of conflicts around, for example, mangroves growing there and mangroves being protected. But they are like, that's our vada, and earlier, whenever we had shortage of space in our house, we would use these areas. And so it's a very different notion, and it's being used also to contest and reclaim and to quietly remake, or sometimes very loudly and vociferously protest. So both things are happening. Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'll stop here. There are but
I have two questions before I open it. One is if the way in which and it seems also the Fisher sort of frame, there is a sense of measurement, right? Like that Dushkal has a sense of measurement, right? That or I don't know. I mean, it sort of was, or at least that is what I thought, that that there's a sense of depletion that is there, right? Like that, if number of fish that one catches, like most of the interviews sort of speak about it in that sense, that that something can be measured in that sense, which is also how the government tends to sort of think about it, right? But there's a other set of calculations that you sort of speak about, and I was wondering if there's a formula for it, which is the sense of the ecological value, right? And the other is this idea of the social value of fairness, right? How does one think about it? If Because it clearly seems in in the events or the ways it has unfolded, that the address of the Parishad, as well as what they're doing, is clearly the government in that sense, right? Or the GR in that sense. It's uh, trying to because this idea of declaring a disaster to get compensation, and then the work, or it seems like the practices are addressing to a sense of justice. But there's also this other sense of time that you're talking about, and I also see a other sense of calculations of how to measure value, right? Which is ecological value, which is not temperature rise, not much like depletion of, but health of the sea, right? And the other one is a sense of fairness of or social value of fairness amongst the community, right? And it is something also that the school has sort of is interested in thinking about questions of spatial justice, but it's always issue in the terms of how do you frame the question of justice if it is not to be framed in the terms of rights and legalities that are there. Are there other, like you're saying, other sense of time and space and values that are possible, right? So I was wondering if in your work you encountered ways of, I don't know if measuring is the right word, or calculating these other ideas of values, right? What is the health of a sea? What is the sense of health of a community in terms of its fairness? So how do they, think about it?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer and something I'm not so sure. So I think in the past, there are several examples that I can give of actual principles that were developed by Fisher Panchayats. And this is across communities, fishing communities in India. And so, in fact, what I do in the essay is I actually give a little more detail on them and actually suggest that official methodologies for understanding drought or dushkar can actually think about some of these and see if there are ways that they can be included even in official norms. However, I think there are some challenges in the contemporary. So, for example, these were a little bit earlier when largely when fishers are talking about ecological value, they have been talking largely related to fishing gear, and so those modes that are seen as more extractive versus those that are seen as more sustainable. And this is actually a huge debate that has been there again between people who have been actually promoting the notion of small scale fisheries. There are very few of them today, and critical scholars to actually argue for sustainability, as opposed to those who do extremely extractive, like ring seine, purseine net fishing. There's all of these, and that's apart from trawler boats or bigger boats. So I think it's these. The field is very complicated today because you have so many now of these different technologies, okay, many of which and many narratives about how certain technologies are sustainable. So even the term sustainable itself has been quite captured, because I've read several essays with purseine net saying purseine net is highly sustainable because you catch fish very quickly, and so therefore you spend less on fuel, so therefore it's sustainable. So I think so I think so it is a complex field, I would say, and I don't think this work has been done, or perhaps it's been done and I'm not so aware of it. I think it's really essential though to consider doing it. I think the forces though against are very, very overwhelming, also because I think within Kori communities themselves, there are so many Koris who bought bigger boats or who use these extractive means themselves. So I think the earlier unity that the fishing cooperative had, and the way in which they were able to fight to steward particular portions of the coast or the sea is no longer. So I think it's a lot of fracture now. And so that's why you don't have, anyway, so that's a much larger story, I think, talking about why this is not possible in some ways, or at least it's very difficult for it to come from within the fishing community. From government, there's absolutely, it seems like no interest.
No, I mean, I asked about this also. Like, I had one last question, which is, which is to do with this etymology of the term dushkal, to the exile in that sense, right? And a month back, I was traveling with this taxi driver who says, like, no one really tells us what happens in the exile. Like, what is the life of Ram in the exile, right? Because it's not a kingdom anymore. You don't have agricultural food. Like, what is the time of the exile in that sense, right? Like, how did he endure the exile? And so I was wondering like, what are the, practices that seem to be emerging in this time of Dushkal, right? Which might not necessarily, hold on to a lot of the things that they valued, right? Like you're saying, it tends to maybe, fracture the communities differently. It might be starting to, think about space and land very differently, like you're saying about, that property lines start becoming stronger, family lines, if they start, like, is there a sense of, what is happening, like Rohit would say, like, what is happening in the meantime of this, like, because there is a sense of wanting justice at the, I don't know, at some point, but there is still a life to be lived, right? And what is changing, right, in that life of the villages at this moment? Yeah.
To answer that in a few minutes, but um, there's like there's I mean, it's a critical question to address, but it's again a question that I struggled with for a long time, as to how to articulate it. And this is also to do with ethics of researcher and the values that I held, the relations that I held with community members and their own feelings, whatever. So there's a lot of that. So I think I would just try to answer by saying that there is so much currently, a lot of a lot of fracture, a lot of contradictions, a lot of capture within the community. And there are also those who oppose that. And so in some ways, one needs to think about this as multiple subject positions that fishers then take. And they see these, and again, these are not necessarily fixed to one person at a time. Okay. So one fisher can take on more than one, and this can move over the course of a certain period of time. So I think this is that there's a lot of weaving back and forth and some amount of flexibility here. And that's why you see people, like, just to give you a simple example, they will take compensation. There are many fishers who have benefited and take compensation. How this cuts is, of course, it's skewed in terms of the more advantaged within the fishing cooperative society. And so in many ways, this reinforces existing inequalities. It also leads to a certain kind of greater anticipation to sort of future economies and possibilities. There's all kinds of opening up of chances. And so you see also a certain kind of speculative mindset that also opens up. And there are a lot of plans and rumors. So for each of these projects that I talked about, there are many more that were proposed but then didn't get built. But if they're not built, that doesn't mean that there are a lot of, there are huge anticipated economies associated with them. So I've been looking at some of that literature, the work of Jamie Cross, which has been quite interesting. And again, there's been, like, for example, I show sometimes the Trombe Koriwada jetty. There was a project to make it world class. Suddenly it appeared one day in a Times of India article. And even the fishers were mystified. They were like, where has this come from? They also had not seen it or heard of it. But so this is just an example of these kinds of projects which is emerging. And so in a sense, it creates then an orientation and an outlook towards the future and future making. So you see a lot of that happening, and that much of that is also happening in particular spaces. Now, one of the sites for this is the Fishing Cooperative Society, which is why people are also hanging out there and going there a bit more than often. So then there's a whole other set which is seeking to stretch and contest. And there have been quite a few successes. I didn't mention some of them today, but there are lots of very interesting ways in which they've contested these on particular projects that have come. They've been managed to institutionalize some of these into policy. However, I think they remain trapped in certain forms of, certain boundaries. For example, the one of identity, this whole notion of the traditional fisher. And I think that has been a huge, it's almost like an entrapment, right? That because most of them don't fit that category anymore. And so it's almost like you have a Koriwada where so much building has happened and so many other quote unquote migrants live. So is that a historic settlement anymore? And then you have those fishers who no longer actively fish, but they're Koris. So they're like, we are Koris. So is that the identity of Kori that you're going to go by? So I think, and the policies reinforce these boundaries, like, for example, the coastal regulatory zone. And so there's like a lot of, I think so. So you see this, and then you see those outside of this who are doing their own quiet reclaiming in all sorts of interesting ways. I won't say more of that here, but yeah. So just to say that this is where I'm currently at, that I don't think it's useful in some sense to think of a singular answer. One needs to, in fact, look at across the ambit of kinds of ways in which people are maneuvering and opening themselves up, and to spaces then and knowledges and skills that will enable them to convert. When
Right. And it goes back to, I mean, I'll stop, but I was, if what it does to time and that sense of what you talk, like, is there a short circuiting of it? Is there something that, opens up from it? So, okay, I'll stop here, and I'll open it up for questions from the audience. Prasad.
We have a question from the live stream. So we have a question from the live stream from Parth.
We just check the question.
He's asking, his question arises from looking at informal fishing practices in the city's open water bodies and how the authorities look at urban water bodies as an object of protection and thus exterminates associations with the water through practice, play, and care. Is it simply how we look at soft, transient edges as impermanence and logics of the creeks/boundaries between salt water and land, and how they extend into urban water bodies as well?
No, thanks, Lalita. In fact, I remember there is this in Odisha. There was Odisha and I think Tamil Nadu. There was the ice box compensation with moped. They would give to men with moped fixed with ice box after the cyclones. But I just want you and also both of you to wear your, and it's basically for students actually. How do you, and you mentioned in your last part just now about the world class terminus and stuff like that. The world class terminus, boat terminus and stuff like that. In the sense that, like, the story that you've opened up for us, how do you want a modern planner to respond to it, or an architect, because that I think that's a very specific question that is going on in their minds at the moment. How do you want? And I think you've already given us a clue in that world class thing that you spoke about, but it's an important thing for us to kind of, very specifically articulate for this set of students. How do you want the planner and an architect to respond to this world that you've opened for us, of this kind of a, you know ecology which is so historic, at the same time so connected and so embedded in the real estate politics, in the identity politics, in so many things. How do you want a planner and an architect to respond to this? Or, I mean, it's for both of you all as well.
I want to bring in two kinds of examples. First is the students' work, the work that we are doing with the 6 semester students in their settlement studies. And over the 4 cycles of work that we've done, which started with Kochi, then Goa, then in Chilika Lake, and after that in Uppada in Andhra Pradesh. We've been noticing a pattern in the drawings that the students have been doing. And that pattern is about how do you bring space, material, and bodies in conversation together. Okay. And this is a pattern that one sees in drawing after drawing. It's our method of drawing has slowly developed, but this is what we see the students are responding to. So that's one part of the work that we've been doing. Prasad Khanolkar calls this as architectural compositions in monsoonal grounds. Okay. In my conversations with Adivasi residents of Sanjay Gandhi National Park, okay, I asked them the question of climate change like this. There was the NGO had filed a court case to protect the national park from encroachment, so on and so forth. It was with the National Green Tribunal. The tribunal ordered the Central Pollution Control Board to do an exercise to measure the change that has happened in the national park. And one of the things that the Pollution Control Board mapped was the change in land surface temperature. And over the last 20 years, the land surface temperature in the national park has increased by 6.5 degrees. It's record. I used this report to ask Adivasi youth, this is what the report says. How do you experience the climate here and its change? And then there is silence. He confused, and he looks at me and he smiles. And then he says, my grandparents taught me a little bit. Okay. When the koel sings, the black clouds appear. And after the holy season, there is a black insect whose name I don't know, okay, feeds on the cotton of the red silk tree and starts becoming saffron. And when it turns saffron, it is a signal, it is a sign that the gods have appeared on the earth and the rain will come. Okay. So the change in the weather or the season is a thresholding, is a thresholding between a particular being, a insect over here, a particular kind of the tea, and somebody who's noticing that. Okay. Now, in all the discussions that I've had with them, there is no separation between climate, weather, and environment. One does not see that change. And I want to kind of put this, the students' work in conversation with this way of thinking. What is changing over here? The climate change narrative is framed through the notion of threshold. Threshold as a range between, say, so much degrees rise in temperature will become a tipping point. But in practice, it's not the noun form of the threshold, but it is the verb form of thresholding that becomes important. So how do you hold space, materiality, and being together is something that is important to think about. And it is towards the notion of thresholding that architects could turn towards, which becomes important in thinking about a composition.
I would give a slightly simpler answer. um, and I think this is also in some ways the way we frame our um, this set of articles that we're writing, which we're calling a climate glossary. We're actually saying, and the whole focus of the glossary is to start from lived experience, from the lived experience of particular communities spread all across the globe, their experience of changes in climate, however they broadly conceive it. And the idea, very specifically, is that these terms are quite, as we said, hyper localized. They are very situated, very context specific. But so, and that's the point, is to actually have these local terms, okay? Emic terms, they're called in anthropology. But not just to have these situated terms, just in terms of seeing them as very circumscribed. In fact, it's remarkable how these very situated terms can travel and resonate with other worlds, other cultures, other communities. And I'm saying this really from our own experience of doing this glossary. It's remarkable across the 8 uh, entries that we have. All of them have come out with some very similar, and again, they're scattered all farmer, but like every community is very diverse. So I think really then to think of these two things together, that something that's hyper local, that's extremely situated, but also something that can travel because it is relational. And I think that, so this is really something that I learned from this whole exercise. And so really then to start from there, don't start with looking at, as a planner, what do other planners say and critique it. Put that aside, I would say, but rather start from what there is. Start from practice, start from communities and their lived experience and their lived practices, and build up from that. And that's really, I think, a lot of this work has in fact very much emerged in that vein. And it has been enormously enriching. I'm not quite sure yet in terms of, I've had all kinds I've shared it with a few planners and architects. I've had a diversity of responses. So it's a mixed bag, I would say, but not wholesale rejection. There's a lot of people who actually would say yes. I mean, and in their own practice have encountered these kinds of contradictions and issues.
Trajectory for climate change. It's very clear, the green building and the climate and the that in that carbon credits. These are not the trajectories to take. Then what are the trajectories to take? So the clues are here: local knowledge, the indigenous knowledge.
I think I've been thinking a lot more of not just relationality, but coexistence. And what would it take to coexist with other very different communities who have very different interests and stakes? And that, I think, is a real big problem for us today, given the kind of polarization and, so anyway, that's something. But I've really been thinking, because this is something that comes out a lot when talking with fishing communities. They won't use a single word to describe it, but a lot of their practice is about then this kind of coexistence based on a certain way that things happen, or a certain way that things are related to other things, or that when something tips here, something happens here. And I think this is related to what Rohit is also talking about when he talks about threshold.
No, I mean, one of the things, and I think this has been a part of, conversations that we've had over the years at sea, which is, and something that, comes in the work, is this question of the scale of time and space, right? That we've, always worked with, boundaries of sight, right? Like the first thing that you do is identify a site for architectural intervention, uh, right? But what I mean, some of the things that now seem to be changing is that we're thinking about not a site, but one is, what is the relationship between where you are and something that is far, like we don't know the scale of it yet, but and that is, I think, something that uh, I think has emerged in the sense of even architectural practices, and I've seen some of them in Spain and Turkey, and which have started thinking about, architectural projects or, responding to climate change, not in terms of like precisely saying green, carbon credits or, how much to reduce, but what is this largest circuit of material, largest circuit of people, largest circuit of, ecological elements within which they're located, and then how does one respond to it, right? So it's not become about, okay, like this is the boundary of where I'm going to see, right? It's not that precinct anymore. Like there's always life that is extended, that there are connections beyond that, right? The second thing I think is that what also comes up is that there's different values associated to land and sea and space, right? Which one of which is the one of property and right and capital, right? Which is to make money out of everything as much as possible. But there are other sense of values, which is not that I love trees, but there is a different kind of relationships that one has with, fishes and gods and ghosts and all kinds of things, right? And that is again a part of the world that we sort of in. And I think that is also, something I think has um, I think the students have sort of started, grasping, which is to look at what are the other kinds of value systems of space and time and land and money that are possible that we work with. So s- a design intervention is not about producing, but it's sort of the shifting these ideas of values. It might be largely working with the questions of private and public and, gender, but also I think now is to start thinking about these values that are associated with ecologies, right? That's where it seems to be. I mean, that seems to be taking a precedence in that sense, right?
Yeah. So Prasad framed this question in conversation as kind of posing it towards how do you speak to students. I just like over the last 4 years, the material that we've gathered in the environment and build form course is a is a very rich material. One sees that as we've started from the Kochi work and how we've arrived at the Upada work, there is a development of a method, but also there is a development of an archive which is very rich, and it doesn't talk the language of green building, it doesn't talk the language of carbon credits, but it develops a very different discourse. I just hope you hold on to that rather than falling into the trap of the credit, the resource consumption kind of discourse. It's a very rich body of knowledge that has emerged both in the form of drawings, but also something that is waiting to be um, sieved and kind of written about in a more strong, organized manner.
Do you want to ask that?
Yeah. Part's question was about I mean, I'll just give the example of the mangroves. That mangroves have been declared as forests and boundaries have been drawn up around. So what Parth is trying to ask is that the government thinks to boundaries, but the living practices don't work with boundaries, and with freezing things, then how do you operate when the government is doing this freezing of boundaries? That was
Um, I mean, absolutely. I would just say yes, absolutely true. I mean, I think there is um, multiple fishing community leaders have talked about, I think, the way in which they see areas that were formerly part of their fishing commons are now overgrown with mangroves. And part of the reason for that is because mangroves have been protected since 2005, but more stringently since 2005 and 2000 and after. But right from the mid 80s, there's been some, that's really when the CRZ comes in for the first time, and sort of ideas around coastal protection start emerging from the mid early 80s, but the first notification comes out only in 91. So basically, since then, I think environmental protection, so it's not even just the boundary of mangroves or lines, but it's even understandings of the environment itself. So talking about the architect and identifying the site and boundaries within which you work in, the same thing happens, I think, for conservation and environmental protections in general. You draw a line and you say, okay, so this is where the mangrove is. So now this becomes then part of the jurisdiction of the forest department. And in fact, there's also some contradictions between state agencies themselves, because all public lands that on which there are mangroves are supposed to be transferred to the forest department, because it is deemed as having the main agency that has the capacity to protect the mangroves. So there's also some tension, I think, among agencies. But so I think there are real problems, I think, around this notion of boundaries and fixing these. And fishers have given countless examples, for example, of earlier DPs, development plans, where in the development plan, for example, in Trombe Korivada, certain areas that have been earmarked for fishing purposes, they're part of their fishing commons, they have managed to get them earmarked under planning reservations in the development plan. And they can no longer access them today because they have mangroves on them. So they have told me that there is no way they would have been earmarked as planning reservations if they had had mangroves growing on them earlier. So just to show that this is recent growth. And so I think this is also a question of thinking about these kinds of expansions. Yeah. And in terms of the question of what to do about it, I think really work with ideas then of conservation and conservationists, and even around broader ideas of protection and how do we think in a different way, not just with boundaries. Um, some of my recent work is around the Thane Creek Flamingo Sanctuary. And I think that has been declared not just a sanctuary, but also a wildlife protected area, and then subsequently a Ramsar site, which is the highest level of protection given for a wetlands. And that also again, not just wetlands, but all UNESCO sites, all heritage, both whether conservation or cultural, all of that again relies on drawing a fixed boundary. So I think these notions of these fixed boundaries come from, I think, much earlier understandings of a certain sort of coloniality, I think, a way of thinking about fixing territory, um, and that have also then bled into ideas of management. How do you manage a space? You have to identify a boundary and then create an institution who has jurisdiction over that area. So I think the question for us becomes then, how do we think of other ways to do this, particularly in a watery space? I think that is even more, I think, the burning sort of question.
Okay. Can I invite if there are more questions from the audience, Sahil? Uh,
Hello, hello. Yeah, so as we were discussing about the idea of boundaries, and we all know how nature doesn't work in these kind of binaries. And me and my friends and some activists were working on a project of collecting how do city respond to the ongoing mangrove cutting in Mumbai. So if anyone knows, there are 45,000 mangroves being affected due to Coastal Road project. And it was a kind of a public moment where we gathered opinions of multiple people, gathered um, um, legal datas, films. There are a lot of artists involved, and we created a document. We created a documentary which has been released like 3 days back. I'm going to put up a link on our main group. It will be really interesting to see um, how is how the difference between the way people approach ecology, particularly the colis and agris, and the way legislative bodies look at ecologies. So if I have to give you like a small gist, it's more about the language with which the ecology is being spoken and the way government bodies respond to certain critics and certain narratives that emerge from the indigenous knowledge. It will be a really interesting conversations if you watch that film. I'm going to put up a link in a minute. Yeah.
So recently in third year, we had a study that Rohit was speaking about in Upada. And we were studying the coastline in Andhra Pradesh, in Upada, which was chipping due to the cyclones that were there. And uh, we were having discussions about how these crises are not looked at as crises, but as routines that happen. And there is a sort of a different kind of urbanization, a different kind of way of life that is lived by the fishermen there. And with this, also, we looked at the kind of consolidation of hierarchies of the politics, of the local politics, of the intimate politics that happen within these smaller settlements. So, Upada is also like a town, but it's on the outskirts. But here we are talking about Mumbai and we are talking about a metropolitan city. So I wanted to ask about what kind of intimate politics or local politics were kind of taking place in these settlements of the fishermen in this specific context of the city, drawing upon your study of the local.
And I'm quite fascinated, I think, by your study as well. I think there's no doubt about the fact that when something is experienced as a matter of routine or regularly, then I think the way in which the practices evolve are also very interesting. And this happens not just, I think, from communities, but also one can see this in government departments. So, for example, with interviews with the disaster management officials in Maharashtra, what was interesting is when we were talking about cyclones, they were actually saying how this is not a state that has typically got cyclones or had much experience of cyclones. And so they talked about how the bureaucracy, the machinery is not equipped to deal with it. They said, we have a long history of drought. We know exactly how to deal with drought. We have the drought manual, we have this, that, and the other. Of course, that's also highly contested, but that's another matter. But so I think so he was also talking about how it's a matter of learning when you have a new kind of disaster. One has to this needs it takes time. And so in fact he was talking about how they were reaching out to Odisha to learn from them better how to manage. So I think that was also kind of interesting to think also at government department level what it means to, because for example, these are not certain things are not designated a disaster if they have never happened before. So when something happens for the first time, it's only through this kind of pressure and politics and pushing. Like, for example, the case you were asking about intimate level politics, I think the politics around Matsya Dushkar is something that has been experienced, but not so intimate, not so much happening at the level of individual Koriwadas always, but at the level of larger fisher collectives. There's been a real push to actually talk much more about what this means and to think about addressing disaster politics and the way in which, disaster, the term disaster, the category disaster and what it constitutes is understood differently. So I think in terms of politics, there are many scales. Within the Koriwadas, again, it's hard to give, and I wouldn't want to give you a single answer because each Koriwada is very, very different from the other. And so I think one would expect to see different kinds of intimate politics. I think one big set of politics maybe that I will share with you though is increasingly there's a lot of politics around fishing commons, and particularly those that are land-based commons, which are seen as having great value because the land is extremely valuable. And so I think part of the struggle then is how do you reimagine these spaces, and what could this imagination look like for what could be in the commons? And there's a lot of conflict here, and there's also a bunch of like appropriation as well. So the institutions that manage these are also then, so a lot of the struggle is not just about the fishing commons and the space, but it's also about the institutions that run these. And institutions are increasingly becoming very important, and particularly those that are seen as more legitimate or less legitimate. For example, I'll give you the Fisher Panchayat, which is the traditional panchayat in the village, in the Koriwada. It's not the same as a village panchayat. It's their own traditional governance structure. In many places, including Trombay, the Fisher Panchayat had become less relevant because there were many newer players that had emerged. For example, the cooperative societies or other kinds of associations, cultural. There's one around youth. There are a number of different SAGs, for example. But what we have noticed, which has been interesting, is that the Fisher Panchayat has actually become quite relevant or more relevant in recent years, largely because they are often the custodians of fishing commons. And they have some legitimacy in the ways in which they are seen to shape them or have some voice in what happens. Now, again, not always, but so I think, these two struggles, I would say, are very crucial ones. But apart from these, there are many others. And so maybe to think also, and what has been useful for me is to think across multiple scales. The smallest, I would say, is the scale of the body. And I've been looking a lot at this kind of very interesting embodied politics, especially women fishers. Very interesting to think about that. And then right up to the scale of collectives at state level, and then connections with the National Fishers Forum. And so part of larger struggles. So at all these scales, you see politics and people involved in different ways. Matsya Dushkar is one of them. But fishers are also often they make connections across. Yeah.
Okay. We'll end the session here. Thank you, Lalita, so much for the talk and for this extended discussion, and just for the generosity of sharing your work, but also I think all the things that you've accumulated being part of this over the 3 years. I'm sure it's not enough time to sort of open up everything, but hopefully also the conversation has helped you in some ways. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. and for your questions and sort of sticking with the conversation and being a part of it. So the next Sea City conversation is on the 24th of July, and it is
So thank you for being a part of this conversation. The next CCC Conversations lecture will be on 24th July after a fortnight by Raghu Jyoti, and it focuses on migration material and memory. We'll keep you posted with the poster. Argo Jyoti is a practicing architect, and will talk about his engagements in architectural practice. Thank you so much.